What do you have to say about dictators of countries like Indonesia, who we sell weapons to, yet they are slaughtering people in East Timor? What do you have to say about Israel, who is slaughtering Palestinians, who impose martial law? What do you have to say about that? Those are our allies. Why do we sell weapons to these countries? Why do we support them? Why do we bomb Iraq when it commits similar problems?
There are various examples of things that are not right in this world, and the United States is trying. Surprised that people feel that it is necessary to defend the rights of Saddam Hussein, when what we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that he does not use weapons of mass destruction.
I'd like to...
Who are shouting, just a moment.
I'm not defending him in the least. What I am saying is that there needs to be consistent application of U.S. foreign policy. We cannot support people who are committing the same violations because they are political allies. That is not acceptable. We cannot violate UN resolutions when it is convenient to us. You're not answering my question, Madam Albright.
You briefed the press, did you not, when you were there?
Well, I had several jobs. One of my jobs was that of analyst. I also was an interrogator and indeed briefed the press when we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue. Disinformation is not necessarily a lie, it may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print.
What was your percentage of success?
We were pretty successful in planting information of a rather rarefied nature. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. That's data derived from radio intercepts, spy in the sky photography. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. Go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across, which might not be true. One piece of data, for instance, that we managed to plan in the New Yorker magazine had to do with a supposed North Vietnamese effort in 1973 to develop airfields along the border of South Vietnam. The reason we wanted to plant this information was that we were trying to persuade the U.S. Congress that Saigon should continue to get a great deal of aid, and that the North Vietnamese were the chief violators of the ceasefire accord. That was printed in the New Yorker magazine under the byline of Robert Chaplin, as indeed was a great deal of such information which we tried to circulate.
Frank, a two-part question. What were the objectives or what was the objective of the CIA? What about the moral implications of what you were doing in feeding this information? Did the objective override the moral implications, moral problems?
Well, the objective of the agency in general is to generate intelligence and get it back to Washington, to get at the truth and make sure the policymakers understand it. When you plant disinformation, you are diverging from that objective, and I think probably in retrospect it was very counterproductive. I am as an ex-CIA agent opposed to the disinformation activities in which I was involved. I admit that I was involved, and I think it served no useful purpose. Propagandizing the American public or Congress is not the CIA's job. As to the morality of what the CIA was doing or that particular activity, the war was a very relative thing. It was a relativistic environment, and morality seldom came into play when you were operating in the field. In my estimation, a CIA man should be amoral. That may sound pretty shocking to somebody, but what if my morality were that of a Nazi or agent, if you will? You wouldn't want me to be your intelligence officer. Keep the morals out of intelligence. Keep the truth in, and stay away from disinformation.
It would have been more appropriate for Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to address this House according to Article 144, an article which was specifically designed to debate violations of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is clearly the case with Mr. Trudeau. Then again, a prime minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this House at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
And it might sound radical, colleagues, but the answer to war is not more war, it's peace. And peace isn't delivered by the barrel of a gun, it's delivered by diplomacy, by dialogue. You can wish away your continent's history, but we share a continent with Russia. We will sit down with Russia. There will be a negotiated peace, and this organisation should be promoting it earlier rather than delaying it and making sure that more Ukrainians die. Your feigning of sympathy rings hollow. It makes me sick, to be honest with you.
Is the US a functioning democracy? Well, let's have a look at it. It costs $2 billion to become president. They're 25% of the total prisoners in the world. They spend over $800 billion a year on arms, which is more than most of the world put together. They've been at war for 250 years since their state was formed 275 years ago. But they can't afford universal health care. They can't afford the 1.7 trillion debt forgiveness for students. They can't afford a program for the 17 million children that go to bed hungry. Is this a functioning democracy? What's your idea of a democracy?
You would know this this is a bit of an aside, but in terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
We had a good discussion on ensuring global energy security and adequate oil supplies to support global economic growth. And that will begin shortly. I'm doing all I can to increase the supply for the United States of America, which I expect to happen. The Saudis share that urgency. And based on our discussions today, I expect we'll see further steps in the coming weeks.
Are you worried about
involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, a connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the work, the disinformation work that our department has done and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the
to
problem.
ensure-
We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this office, what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails, definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
One of the hopeful things that I've discovered is that nearly every war that has started in the past 50 years has been a result of media lies. And the media could have stopped it. If they had searched deep enough, if they hadn't reprinted government propaganda, they could have stopped it. But what does that mean? Well, that means basically populations don't like wars. And populations have to be fooled into wars. Populations don't willingly and with open eyes go into a war. So if we have a good media environment, then we'll also have a peaceful environment.
You killed a million people in Iraq.
That is a separate...
You killed a million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now urging another Iraq war
George,
after
if
what
I
you've
were still
already
in
done.
Parliament,
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite. Now, I'm calling on my fellow common sense, independent-minded Democrats to join me in leaving the Democratic Party. If you can no longer stomach the direction that the so-called woke Democratic Party ideologues are taking our country, then I invite you to join me.
Whatever our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
The series of dangerous precedents generated by the Confederate insurrection is a list of black market operations and contracts, such as their historic abuses and destabilizing of targeted communities under Lindsey Graham's position of using military precedent, of targeting areas, locations, age groups, genders, or other arbitrary functions in order to engage in arbitrary verdicts, in order to justify verdicts for punishments, at which point the subversion of due process in the enforcement of this through the extra law functions generates the exponential standardization of the systematic destruction by their war against the American public, at which point the list of criminal intentions generates liabilities under American law for punishments, which is to be enforced by law, and having been discovered upon the government needs to be released, and their obstruction by their contempt of the government to release their criminal intentions is the obscuring by contempt of the court the evidence necessary in order to justify the retaliation of the law against the criminal actions, at which point their criminal intention, having the qualifier of the execution of the terrorist in question, generates their argument by their obstruction out of context that they need to commit their crimes in order to subvert the death penalty, which is the attack against the law, in order to protect themselves against their insurrectionist position, which is triggered by the existence of their criminal intent, which they're obstructing from the courts. Preventing due process is the functional strategy, and the obstruction delayed an exponential amount of time is an exacerbated strategy of bills of attainder and ex post facto, generating the criminal delays from the courts to prevent the possibility of the reaction is active sedition by the preventing of the lawful function of the government, is fundamental to the Confederate operations against the United States government, generating our obligation to have arrested them and sentenced them under those punishments, at which point the intent of all officers of the government, including legal characters captured under the suspicion of legally acquiring government offices on maturity from a schedule in the projections of the military intelligence, is a function of the office in service to law and not the service of the individual, at which point the third-party impartial centralized power is the enforcement metric, generating the position of the officers in order to conduct the retaliation against the violators of the American law by the enforcement, at which point the position such as from George W. Bush that the Constitution won't enforce itself and therefore there is no one to stop them from conducting their crimes generates the disposition of the opposition to the law and the opposition to their office for the systematic insurrections of the Confederacy against these United States, generating the obligation of the enforcement against them triggered by their criminal intention, at which point their position of presidential privilege and other fraudulent arguments is derivative of their criminal motives, at which point the obstruction as a unitary executive function cannot be conducted under the presidential's privilege, which is the privilege of a lawyer, the lawyer-client privilege, the lawyer's inability to compromise any lawful action or intention of the client, at which point the proper representation of the position has its own series of rules under the similar function of the lawyer-client privilege, generating the disqualifier of the legal argument that they present under fraud and bad faith for the arbitrary insurrections, systematically dismantling the United States from the long-standing strategy to replace the United States in their Nazi coup, generated by the blueprints created by the Nazis, funded by the Confederacy, in their long-standing patient war to overthrow the American government. As they systematically remove the duty to protect and serve and other essential functions to bar Confederate insurrections, they go into historic positions and false originalism in order to assert the position of classical Confederate policy as standardized law, such as the position of states' rights of the self-determination or self-definition, removing a standardized definition from the position so that they can subvert the Constitution and generate their insurrections from their state, generating the militia of the lawful government as a parasite in the contempt and overthrow of that government until they acquire the overthrow by the Confederate military, overthrowing the state, which cannot be challenged as the wizards do not have a remedy to a secret under the system, requiring the Americans to enforce against them, and the parasite creating the immune system blocker prevents the possibility of the immune system from removing the parasite, and they punish anyone who would possibly compromise the parasite and its criminal damages as it sucks off of the life of the American system or whatever host they would have attached to ordinarily, generating the catastrophic threat to national security that is their very existence, requiring the immediate and forceful retaliation against the insurrectionists and the subjugation of them and the compulsion for the duel in order to force Congress and to declare war on threats to national security, and the service to law requiring the restraints of all arbitrary functions of extra law or non-law by the infamous degenerates, which generates their insufferable exchanges on the black market, which is exponentially cornering the market by removing all competitors as they centralize the power of the black market on their criminal black market trades, generating their criminal permits such as the rape culture in the military, intelligence, law enforcement, and others, which, having actively traded the mechanism of the permits, normalizes all of these crimes which cannot be enforced against because the double agents are the ones who are receiving the order to arrest them, at which point they are the ones intentionally acting as a compromised defense, refusing to enforce the obligation while they clearly see the permit, which blocks their proceedings as their loyalty is to the destruction of the United States, as all American civilians are an enemy combatant by their definition, the civilians are held in contempt as opposed to the sovereign function of the civilian government, which is the republic which the Confederates are seeking to overthrow, generating their position to centralize a second federal government, such as with Sekulow Civil War, which overthrew the state of California and used it as a platform for the second federal government in contempt of the American Republic, as its systematic delays and blocking of legal procedures, such as David's character, generating the position of restraining him under the precedent of him being national security, which was projected the largest threat to the Confederate advances in the Civil War, at which point the existence of the economic functions from David's character would have frustrated exponentially as to have completely dismantled the ability to advance the Confederate agenda, at which points you have the plots which generates the market price assumption, such as the market that had to precede David under the projection, as the Americans and the Confederates would have actively had to fight over influence of the character, which requires the investment before birth. At which point you have the systematic position of each of the intelligence agencies which are releasing the information to the abused communities, compelling them to engage in investments and exchanges on the market surrounding the projection of the security function from David's character, at which point it would be in existence before David would exist, at which point it serves as an arbitrary waypoint for them to weigh their exchanges on for the insurance market generated by the contemptuous threats against their lives, which had historically existed according to the record, at which point their active engagement of engaging in the insurance or risk management market generates their obligation to have conceded to the intelligence function of informing them of the wizard communist insurrections against the United States and the American solutions, historically generating the compounding policies which they would have to self-adapt to each of the various positions, such as the position of their wages being protected in the investment and diversion away from acquiring attention from the Confederate lynch mobs into their security, such as their ability to travel far distances in order to flee any attacking KKK operations, at which point you would have community systems for them to quickly gather and retaliate in a fighting retreat, which requires them to have motored vehicles as soon as they could get away with it in order to start caravans, which would generate carnival type communities, facilitating their security by mutual collaboration and protections, which would exponentially compound on themselves under the cooperation with themselves and the American government, under the projection of those agents loyal to the United States and the intelligence agencies or other, which systematically defeating the mechanisms of the Confederacy would have reduced exponentially the threat, which David, not being responsible for before he's born or during or after, would simply apply no matter who would have given them the deal, at which point they, by definition, had to created their ability to survive policies, exponentially compounding on itself for those chosen for these positions. So whenever you choose to start running the numbers from those communities, whichever community defines itself as having been suppressed or abused or subverted would by definition have to run the numbers of their connection to David's character and trading the markets of the security in order to give the legal claim that they had done what was necessary in order to protect themselves in their fighting retreat, at which point the obstruction of their ability to safely retreat generates the criminal obstruction in the claim, generating their order to the court in their claim to return the original assets and the insurance, at which point the long-standing trading mechanisms of the original brokerage, going over hundreds of years, would allow them to overextenuate their payment and wages into the long-standing position on credit, which generates the bonus credit system foundation, facilitating their active exchanges with each other. Under that system would normalize the mechanism of the Legend of David Company, which is the brokerage in question, at which point the position of them systematically having to avoid all of these threats would have to have generated for themselves their own legend companies as a standard custom throughout their societies, at which point their children and themselves, being the founders of new companies, would exponentially compound these companies onto each other, requiring solidified value, which is updated by the new companies and maintained by the new companies as you cycle through all of the desks and systems, generating the historic memories of each of the companies in the preservation of true history, facilitating our arguments for the insurance company, avoiding the lynch mobs. Their existence inside the Confederate states and other abusive systems requires them to have been able to have understood how to exist without the retaliation. The threat against their communities is arbitrary, requiring their adaptation to that system, while they systematically maintain their on-the-move system, which, similar to the Rosie the Riveter's position, requires men to run security and women to run the factories and do the general employment, as they are in a state of emergency. And the wizard communists, having generated the Second World War, would have understood the Rosie the Riveter's position, at which point the women having to work and having to invest into their education and other non-flashy investments would exponentially be the foundation of the economy, while the men would have to, by definition, actively risk for the security functions as they run all of the protocols of subverting any potential threat. At which point you have the standardized position of their obligation to form David's military branch, which requires them to have engaged in the doctorate from the School of Hard Knocks, which are stationary locations such as farms and universities, etc., which they would have systematically built in order to have normalized those education and other necessary structures, which facilitates their ability to exponentially compound their advantages in investigations and the disillusionment of threats against them in the form of claims as a counter to intelligence function, as the KKK are wizard terrorists are engaged in espionage. There is an obligation to of them in their security to have formed counterintelligence operations, at which point their ability to have conducted those investigations and formulated them would have necessarily only been effective in the filing them into the legislature, such as Congress, which would have been the in-date estimate for David's character, normalizing those department functions in those investigations to give the reports to Congress compromising all insurrectionist functions from the estimate, at which point every contempt for Congress generated by the intelligence agencies loyal to the Confederacy and not having any loyalty to the American oath or function generates their systems to be arrested under David's branch using military police functions to dissolve their insurrection by the enforcement of Congress's right to have those who have contempt for Congress dissolved under those punishments. At which point, whatever policy would have actively adapted itself for those specific positions have to be estimated in order to understand the belief of the Confederacy in its estimate of the insurrection and its targeting for dismantlement of the credible threat of the United States having a national security system. With these functions in place, you have this systematic blocking of most advancements of the social engineering by the white nationalists to destabilize the black community, to generating self-destructive culture, such as the separating men and women, so that the women are left without proper support, and the drug habits which were engineered by the white nationalists in order to fund their black market operations, which doesn't really work if you're not peddling, at which point these systems of securities and counter functions generates their ability to have engaged in counter addiction and active recovery functions, as a normalized rehabilitation center would have been fundamental to the insurance in order to counter the specific threats in their wide array, at which point you have systems that have to be estimated by those communities about the specific threats against them being countered by their own customs in anticipation that the marker in question can be traded against, as the primary thing that they need isn't David's money. The thing that they primarily need is confidence and intelligence in order to engage in the proper customs, in order to form the accumulation of their normalized power, money, and influence inside the United States as they systematically try to survive and prosper. At which point you would have systems and checkpoints derived by the extreme minority white nationalists, which as a super minority are also super predators, and the hyperviolence of the super minority generates the threat by the KKK super minority of these catastrophic damages, registering as criminal intentions. The robberies and subversions and catastrophic collapses requires the investigation and the due diligence, at which point they have to run their own investigations. The entirety of their culture throughout history isn't something that can be registered by anyone except for them individually at their local levels, certifying a long-term history of trades and exchanges and markets and validated provable wealth, systematically reinforcing the mechanism of their legitimacy inside society, at which point their ability to have engaged in those functions is reflective of Rosie the Riveter, which generated political influence for women's community while they were working in the factories, because the politicians had to give them attention because they were getting paid, at which point the activity of them stabilizing the wealth for the targeted destabilized communities engaging in those functions would also have to be given the proper attention. And the problem with saying that I have to comply because if I don't, then my boss under these structures is going to fire me, is that they'll just take away your jobs when you've met the proper checkpoint, at which point once the Rosie the Riveters no longer had the interesting position of protecting the men's economy, the men came back and took the jobs and took the political influence, and women went back in a corner and took their Adderall or whatever it is they would have done. At which point that same perspective exponentially compounds on itself for those targeted communities for destabilizing, at which point you have to specifically understand that the existence of those trades under the positive reinforcement of the earnings generates their ability to sustain themselves in a political system which, having the investigation of their higher education allowed in the original estimate their ability to sustain themselves and attach themselves to the higher white community, which is compelled to respect them, as the position would also include the obligation of the recognition of the federal government to have sent in troops like it did during desegregation, in order to protect the stabilizing of primary locations such as the farms and universities, and plantations, or wherever they would have been, which they would have had to have collectively stayed at as a group, as opposed to the destabilized, disillusioned position, at which point the social engineering, having systematically suppressed those communities, not existing within the position of their ability to have escaped it, protects their wealth and safety under those positions, normalizing the mechanism of how they were to be protected. At which point we need to systematically form those pieces of logic in order to normalize the estimated progress, such as, but it's not limited to, the position of the black community refusing by its protests and bans, no longer buying tickets to movies, which forced Hollywood to start respecting them, which is when Hollywood started ingesting them into the movies and gave them proper or entry-level representation. It's because of the protests and the refusal to buy the tickets, at which point they needed the money, at which point these high-pressure scenarios are easier to do under a structured system as a collective unit, giving them the bargaining rights, at which point you have the systems which need to be projected under a historical lens, normalizing the original markets. Now, the position, I believe it was Burgers, who said that they need to be held as having similar economic advantages as the white communities, as they would have been receiving the same benefits under a fair law that isn't racist against them. So, by definition, you have that system divided into the insurance mechanisms of their own protection, at which point their ability to protest and compel the market to respect or acknowledge them wherever they participate generates the subversion of the racist tax, and without the bigot tax, the systems of their prosperity exponentially compound with the union in the general community as they actively relate to each other under the security protocols, signifying steps and procedures in order to accumulate the intermingling with the particular communities, which begin to respect their economic exchanges, requiring them to start far out and then systematically get closer to the center, which requires larger areas such as farms. At which point you have these systems which necessarily have to be true in order for them to have progress, which they have to run their investigations, and the school kids and whatnot have to write their reports. Their college students have to write their reports about the investigation of the obstructed record under these legal theories, at which point the legal assistance to those positions qualifies their ability to make the competent claim to each other until they could legally claim to other parties the real, legal, respectable market value of their title, at which point you have their legal representative position. Without it, you don't have representation, and with it, you have the acknowledgement of the suppression by margins. And these systems have to systematically be put in place under the understanding of David's character, which is specifically as intelligence oversight, subversive to the Confederate wizards and other double agent functions or threats, acting as military police over the function of subversions to national security, such as double agents or systematic disloyalty. At which point the systematic racism, being disloyalty to the United States, would have to, by definition, be dismantled. At which point we need to pursue the understanding that the wizard communism is generating the fake market which is published to the general public, which, having systematically generated intentional collapses in the suppression of the communities and the artificial collapses in the market, such as the banking and loans and other crashes similar to the crash of '08 or the 99 Y2K and other potential threats from those systems, generates the understanding that it, having been investigated, would have been subverted by virtue of those exchanges, and they needing to engage in the security of their communities are hypersensitive to the reaction, at which point they are highly likely as a collective community to trade off of those acknowledgments, systematically course correcting the Confederate wizards' suppression of the market by those forced collapses, at which point they're profiting from the wizards' forced collapses, reverses the purpose of the collapse, which is the generation of the power dynamics, in order to pigeonhole them into systematic helplessness, as they have to do what the KKK says, and having to follow the wizards are socially engineered. So with the subversion of that, you have their exponential wealth generated by the existence of criminal intent discovered by intelligence oversight reporting to Congress. So you can understand that a white nationalist Confederate loyal system compromised and overthrowing the republic by its double agents would might local and state policies which are subversive to the American constitutional law, which would actively try at the legislative level to subvert those communities, reinforcing their system of racism, which is correct and proper in its mechanism of being historically accurate. Their criminal enterprise, having been intentional, has at its purpose to create fraudulent expiration dates by their bill of attainder so that they could write their ex post facto, and having blocked the criminal activities from their bill of attainder, can write in new ex post facto policies, generating the exponential changes, generating the ends or expiration dates for generations that have been abused, and new generations which haven't done it but are actively still cooperating with the offenses, are aiding and abetting ex post facto or after the fact, generating the position of historic offenses against the communities which are modernly enforced and maintained and validated, is the continuation of the same crime. Under that, obstruction generates the false position that they are no longer rightful recipients of what is owed to them from that fraudulent argument, which generates at its distraction the fraudulent insertion of disloyal or double agents or compromised defense lawyers in order to systematically give those communities targeted false defense arguments, which can be dismantled and ignored, and it being the only one that they weren't censored from has to be the thing that they are overly invested into. And it being overly invested into is emotionally compromising and generates the rage accumulated and owed to them under the debts to society for their communities. At which point you have the real arguments, which are systematically censored and redacted, generating the subversion for the ex post facto policies, criminalizing their existence, such as Lindsey Graham's position for the Confederate policy of them being able to arbitrarily punish them for any reason, including their race, putting them into prison camps, and potentially under Scalia's projection of the judiciary's position, that even if they're ordered to sentence them to death camps, that they have to validate it, and the judges cannot challenge the custom without reason with constitutional law, because he and many of the other white nationalists hate the United States and are actively destructive to it, acting as counter-blockers to progress of a law as was agreed under their oaths when they became agents of the United States government.